AMD has announced their new Zen 4 Raphael desktop processors that go on sale in just a few weeks' time. So why don't you put me on pause, grab yourself a drink, come back, press play again, and I'll tell you exactly what I think about them. Okay, the thing is, we've known a fair amount about Zen 4. AMD started talking about it CES of this year, so that's 9 months ago. Good lord, hadn't even started yet. However, the roadmaps showing AMD's progression through nodes and technology names, we've seen this for years. So really it's building upon detail, and the thing is, in the past months the leaks have been coming thick and fast, such that we've known a huge amount about Zen 4. One of the things that's really stood out in my mind is the images of the new processors. The bizarre spider shape with its 8 legs. The new AM5 socket uses an LGA layout, and as a consequence the components have moved from the bottom of the processor to the top. This means the heat spreader has cutouts to accommodate those components, and as a consequence we have this extraordinary new processor. I quite like the look of it. I think the heat spreader itself looks very thick. I have to wonder what happens the first time someone gets an excess of thermal compound in the wrong place, particularly liquid metal. Liquid metal, presumably will short everything, will be a catastrophe. The delidded Zen 4 processor looks by eye exactly like a Zen 3 processor. Nothing you might think to see here. Happily, Dr. Lisa Su, the boss of AMD, was on hand to tell us lots about the new processor and its technology.
And we're going to start today with our new Zen 4 core that spans from high-end servers to desktop PCs to notebook PCs.
We were quite clear for some few weeks that AMD was going to launch 4 models of Zen 4, a Ryzen 9 with 16 cores, Ryzen 9 with 12 cores, a Ryzen 7 with 8 cores, and a Ryzen 5 with 6 cores. These read directly across from the current Ryzen 5000s, so replace the 5 with a 7. Voila, you've got the new processor. The obvious changes from this brief chart of feeds and speeds: the cores and threads remain the same, the clock speeds have increased mightily, the L2 cache has doubled, and the TDP for the Ryzen 9s has gone up significantly to 170 watts. Let's take the Ryzen 9 7950X as an example, and you can see how it breaks down. That combination of L2 and L3, 80 megabytes, is absolutely huge. But it can also be seen that Ryzen 9 7950X would appear to have a fair amount in common with the current Ryzen 9 5950X, a processor that I myself bought quite recently at a significant discount, because of course we've all known Zen 4's coming for a while, so you can get Zen 3 processors nice and cheap. Cheers, AMD. Returning to the deck, just look what AMD is claiming. A 13% approximate uplift in IPC, that's instructions per clock, and the clock speeds themselves have increased significantly, so multiply the one increase by the other increase, up to 29% of total single thread performance gain. Curious wording, that, total single thread performance gain. However, big numbers. You have to be a bit wary of the next slide. A comparison of Ryzen 9 7950X with 5950X. We are not just comparing CPUs. It's a different platform. We've got different chipsets, and we've got DDR5 memory versus DDR4 memory. So it's not just CPU against CPU. Having said that, these look like bold claims, but based on AMD's recent history, you can probably take this to the bank. AMD's next slide you have to take the pinch of salt. They're comparing all 4 of the Zen 4 processors with Intel's Core i9-12900K. But of course Intel's on the verge of launching their 13th gen processor, so this may well be true. However, the processor they're using as a comparison is soon to be replaced. Technology leadership, this is entirely down to TSMC. So yes, indeed, quite true, and of course it's a slight kick in the pants to Intel with their 10 nanometer known as 7 and whatever comes next. TSMC is ahead on the nodes, AMD's using TSMC, so they get the win. Our high performance journey continues. Zen 4 delivered as promised. Again, a kick in the pants to Intel. AMD promises, AMD delivers. They've been doing this for some years now. 5nm delivered as promised. The processor CCDs or core complexes are on TSMC 5nm. The IO die is on TSMC 6nm. And AMD saying we have a strong CPU roadmap. The thing is with AMD, a roadmap and what gets delivered tend to be one and the same thing. Zen 4 core architecture, the changes, a 13% uplift in IPC, new front-end design. They haven't just shrunk the die and moved on, they've actually changed what goes on inside the processor. AVX 512. It'll be interesting to see what that delivers in practice, because up to now AVX has been an Intel thing, and then 5nm process technology. Yes, indeed. I've included this next chart for the fun of it, just because it's so bloomin' wide. It's AMD comparing the new Zen 4 against Zen 3 in a whole variety of different tests. Obviously, this is their internal testing. What it's showing is that the new processor is significantly better in some areas than the current processor. And then AMD does something I've never seen before, which is to break down where these increases come from. So it's a stacked chart. The front end contributes most of the increases, load store a fair amount, branch prediction a few, the execution engine some, L2 cache relatively little. I'm surprised by that because the change in L2 looks like a huge change. It suggests those other changes are even more significant. And we have another use of the word significant gains in both performance and efficiency. We're comparing the new 7950X with the current 5950X at 3 different power settings. What you can see is at 65 watts, the new processor stomps all over the current processor. Increase the TDP, i.e. give the current processor more power to work with, 105 watts and 170 watts. You've still got a hefty increase, but it's far less of an increase. And as we are going to be running these processors at full power or something akin to it, that 35% number makes more sense. I personally own a Ryzen 9 5950X. It's never occurred to me to run it at 65 watts. But to anyone who has, I say cheers. 5nm leading edge process technology. This boils down to TSMC, and basically it's AMD's way of thanking them. There's nothing else to say there. Zen 4 drives significant efficiency for desktop. This is obviously a good thing. AMD at the moment eclipses Intel for efficiency. It looks like that's going to be the same for the new Intel, new AMD comparison. If at the moment you use 140 watts for AMD, you might be using 220 watts, 250 watts, or 290 watts for Intel. There are big differences. It's not subtle. It's like up to double for the Intel processors. And then we see a CPU roadmap where as we go through the different types of Zen, we might be on 5nm or 4nm. We might be on 4nm or 3nm. In other words, the design can be shrunk. This looks interesting. The new processor comes with the new Socket AM5. This is where things get, to my mind, slightly confusing because we're currently on AM4 with Zen 3 and Ryzen 5000. We're moving to AM5 with Zen 4 and Ryzen 7000 because Ryzen 6000 is used for mobiles. So the numbers are out of kilter. We can expect AM5 to persist for some few years, which means that AM5 will doubtless be used with Zen 5. So Ryzen 9000, no doubt. The numbers are going to be disjointed. The facts about AM5, so it's an LGA socket, which is exactly what Intel's been using for some years, 18 pins. The number of pins is not particularly pertinent, except of course Intel's currently on LGA 1700, about to move to LGA 1800. So the two sockets would appear to have a certain amount in common, up to 230 watt socket power delivery. That's a lot of power, and it's obviously more than the TDP. How it works in practice, what the motherboard manufacturers actually provide, remains to be seen. I'll be mildly stunned if EVGA doesn't come out with an overclocking motherboard that does more than 230 watts. Supports DDR5 and PCI Express Gen 5 storage, and works with AM4 coolers. We recently had a chart, yesterday, from EKWB detailing which of their coolers would transfer from AM4 to AM5. The answer is many of them. They're going to be making available adapter kits, so it's not to just take the current hardware, plonk it on AM5. You'll be taking the guts of the cooler and with an adapter putting it on your new AM5. Once again, I think the heat spreader on the new processors looks bizarrely thick, but who knows till we actually see a bare heat spreader in our hands. I know there's one or two in circulation, but I've not actually seen one myself to see just how thick the presumably copper material is. I won't be able to judge. By eye, the heat spreader, it's 1/4 of an inch, it's 6mm, and that would make no sense. So I imagine it's recessed inside. Different chipsets will have different capabilities. In the past, they've tried doing this with the A and the B series, and it got slightly vexing. This one supports only old school USB. This one supports the new USB-C, stuff like that. In this case, it's quite clear that AMD is going for much more serious differentiation in the motherboards. So some will support PCI Express Gen 5 storage, some will support Gen 5 graphics, but perhaps you'll have support for the new graphics but not for the new storage, or vice versa. I can see that getting a bit messy, but they do love their product stacks, sadly. AMD EXPO Technology, this is memory overclocking, it's XMP for AMD. We have seen people commenting on Twitter that there's no reason why a memory module in the SPD can't store profiles for both XMP and EXPO. So if a manufacturer chooses, they could have profiles built in, you plug it into your motherboard and it goes, aha, EXPO, here we go, or aha, XMP, here I go. I'm not sure how much difference EXPO is going to make to the end user, but memory matters and it's a big deal. So the fact AMD is moving forward here, I welcome that. Ambitious goals delivered versus Core i9-12900K. Right, the processor that's just about to be surpassed, we'll ignore that. Pricing, Ryzen 9 7950X $699, the 12-core $549, the 8-core $399, the 7600 is $299. This pricing doesn't shock me, although the 16-core looks relatively cheap. But it does lay down some markers for Intel and their 13th gen processors that will be announced very shortly, because Intel doesn't have quite as many options. They're going to have, once again, i9, i7, i5. So this is basically telling Intel what they can get away with. They cannot push their i9 beyond $699. In fact, I don't think they can push it beyond $650. And we understand Intel's quite keen to push their new processors hard. I would have thought they'd like to see them at $799. That's not going to fly. The new 13th gen Core i7 is due to have the same core configuration, I understand, as the current Core i9. So the new Core i7, it's going to land in the middle there, and if it's priced towards $400, it'll be competitive, I imagine. If it's priced at $549, not so much. And then we get down to the Ryzen 5 against Core i5. The current Core i5 is brilliant. Absolutely superb processor. The trouble is you need DDR5 and a new motherboard to support it. The Ryzen 5 7600X at $300 will probably be a very good processor, but once you factor in a new motherboard and DDR5, that may be a close fight. But at the top end, it looks to me like Ryzen 9 7950X is going to stomp all over the new Core i9. A declaration from AMD: first desktop PC processor in 5nm, world's fastest processors for gaming and creation. Define fastest, stompiest, very likely. Fastest actual clock speed? No, that's not true, I shouldn't think. AM5 platform with DDR5 PCI Express Gen 5 storage, yes indeed, and support planned through 2025 plus. As we take another sip of sweet, sweet Camden IPA. I'm going to say here and now, everything AMD has told us you can take to the bank. I trust all of it. There will be nuance to that statement, but we will not, I am sure, have been led astray. There are a few things that AMD hasn't spelled out. The new I/O die moves from GlowFlow 12nm to TSMC 6nm, which means that you have a chipset on the motherboard that is presumably also from TSMC, because previously the chipset and the I/O die have been one and the same thing. So the chipset, I/O die and CCDs, TSMC end to end, presumably 6nm and 5nm. I think that gives AMD significant potential for speeding up communication and reducing latency across the motherboard and the processor, and presumably also with their RDNA 3 graphics. In this instance, the direct access memory side of things could become a really big deal, and that doesn't really feature in clock speeds. Well, how fast your processor, 4.7 GHz, 5 GHz, 5.5 GHz. Latency is a different conversation. I suspect this hardware is going to be as fast as Hades, particularly with Gen 5 storage and Gen 5 graphics. Other points that AMD didn't make such a big deal about in their briefing and their live cast, which strike me as being significant. The Ryzen 7000s include a tiny RDNA 2 IGP. We understand it's lower in spec than even the lowest laptop IGP at present, so what it can do remains to be seen, but Intel's integrated graphics, which have been feeble, can power the likes of Adobe Premiere at astonishing speeds. You can render your video and you output it using just an Intel IGP impressively fast. So the IGP, gamers, sure, forget it. Everybody else, we need to see how that actually operates in practice, and then we need the likes of Adobe to get their mitts on it, because what was the technology that it's gone. Whatever the technology is that Premiere uses for the Intel graphics, it took years for that to come on stream, and then it worked and it was blooming amazing. So the IGP, don't ignore that. Plus, how many people do you know who have a PC but they don't actually use the graphics? They just want a decent sized monitor. I mean, they could use a small laptop easy enough, except they want a big screen, they want a mouse and a keyboard. An IGP, it can power many monitors should you choose. Certainly you can use it for shopping at Amazon, looking at your email, paying your bills and all that other boring stuff. So the IGP, don't pass that by. Also, the L2 cache has doubled from Zen 3 to Zen 4. The L1 and the L3 remain the same. Latency has slowed very slightly, but work that is contained within L2 I think will be much faster than it is with current Zen 3. So the L2 cache, I think that could prove to be hugely significant for certain jobs. And finally, we understand that 3D V-cache versions of these processors will be announced at CES 2023 in Vegas. That's 3 months away. Which versions? At the moment, there's just a Ryzen 7, and it's been very effective. It's more expensive, you can't overclock it. Good for gamers. So presumably AMD is going to look at whatever Intel brings out with their 13th gen, and they'll respond with specific 3D V-cache versions of Zen 4 just to make sure that AMD continues to win. I'm in a slightly different position to you. When I do case reviews, I build PCs in them. I have to put choose the hardware, and for the look of it I tend to use current hardware, so I'll be using some Zen 4 Ryzen 7000 hardware without a shadow of a doubt. I'll be buying that hardware. Luke does AMD, I do Intel. My AMD hardware is my own. I'll probably buy a Ryzen 5 processor. I'm tempted by one of the Ryzen 9s, either 12 or 16 core, and as the pricing's so close, it may well be the 16 core. I myself own in my own PC a Ryzen 9 5950X, bought it quite recently as I mentioned. I don't think I'll be switching from Zen 3 to Zen 4 in this current generation, but once the Zen 4 hardware I buy in the next few weeks becomes the last gen, if you see what I mean, so I'm looking ahead now a year, no doubt that hardware will become my personal PC hardware. So what I buy for test purposes will become my own hardware in time. So I see myself buying Ryzen 9 7950X, probably Ryzen 5 7600X, and no doubt RDNA 3 graphics as well. I'm not recommending you do that, I'm going to do it for work purposes. A few months ago I thought, yeah, a nice bump, and right now it feels like it's going to be a big bump. But until Luke gets his reviews down, I won't know for sure. Anyway, cheers to you all.